Breaking news this Wednesday night, a special rapporteur appointed. The Prime Minister names the person who will oversee probes into election interference. Another bank falters, this time in Switzerland.
Credit Suisse has a lot of links to the financial sectors of other countries.
Why shares of Credit Suisse have sunk and what it says about the industry. Cyclone Freddy's ferocity, shattering lives and likely weather records too.
Well, it was almost essentially unbelievable.
What sets this cyclone apart from other storms? And we have liftoff.
Go Falcon, go Dragon.
How McMaster University's space mission could help keep astronauts healthy.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The Prime Minister has announced who will head the investigation into election interference in Canada. Former Governor General and former law professor David Johnston will be the so-called Special Rapporteur, a role the Prime Minister created last week, saying the person appointed will have a wide mandate and make expert recommendations on combating interference and strengthening Canada's democracy. Johnston, who is 81 years old, was appointed Governor General in 2010 by then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and he held the role until 2017. Our chief political correspondent David Aiken is with me. David, what the opposition really wants is a public inquiry. So what's the reaction so far to David Johnston's appointment?
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is, Donna. All those opposition parties are out with statements saying, we want a public inquiry. We don't want a special rapporteur. But if there has to be a special rapporteur, the Bloc, the NDP saying, OK, I guess it's going to be difficult to claim David Johnston has any partisan hue. Now, Pierre Poilievre says he was not consulted on Johnston's appointment. And some of Poilievre's advisors, one of them being Jenny Byrne, a very close advisor, she's tweeting her skepticism that Johnston might be a neutral appointment because she doesn't like the work Johnston has done as head of the Leaders Election Debate Commission, and she doesn't like the fact that Johnston sits on the board of the Trudeau Foundation. And Donna, I have to point out that foundation has nothing to do with Justin Trudeau. It's his dad, Pierre. It has nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with elections. In any event, as you mentioned, Johnston was appointed by Stephen Harper. And when Stephen Harper appointed David Johnston, he said that Johnston represents the best of Canada. Johnston represents hard work, dedication, public service, and humility. End quote. That's Stephen Harper. Now, Johnston has been called upon often to be an independent arbiter in our political process. He's starting way back in 1984 in that famous election debate between Brian Mulroney and John Turner. That's the one where Mulroney had that famous line, "You had a choice, sir." As you mentioned, he's a constitutional lawyer, law professor, eventually became president at the University of Waterloo. So that's Johnston. Now, the big question he's been asked to answer: do those allegations of foreign election interference, many of which were first reported right here on Global News, do those allegations require a public inquiry? All three opposition parties say yes, definitely needed. The Prime Minister has not ruled it out. He argues his government is doing something else about the issue of foreign interference. But Trudeau is on the record saying that if his special rapporteur, David Johnston, says a public inquiry is in fact warranted, then a public inquiry will be convened. Johnston will also make other recommendations as he sees fit on ways to further protect our democracy, uphold confidence in our elections. Now, how long will Johnston have to do all this work? That is TBD, Donna.
Okay, lots more to come. Thanks, David. We'll come back to you again a little later on another story. The former head of Canada's COVID-19 vaccine program, who was removed after sexual assault allegations came to light and was later acquitted, is now suing the federal government in a wide-ranging lawsuit. Major General Danny Fortin is claiming $6 million in damages for what the suit calls reprehensible, extreme, flagrant, and high-handed conduct. Fortin's legal team alleges defamation, misfeasance in public office, conspiracy, and negligent investigation. The suit names over a dozen people, including the Prime Minister, the current Chief of the Defence Staff, and the former Health Minister, Patty Hajdu. In Amqui, Quebec, the questions continue about why anyone would intentionally run down pedestrians on the street. 2 men were killed on Tuesday afternoon. 2 other people remain in critical condition after the driver of a pickup truck hit them. He's been charged with 2 counts of dangerous driving causing death, but the motive, if there was one, remains a mystery. Touria Izri reports on a community in mourning.
One agonizing question hangs over this small Quebec town. Why did someone deliberately drive a pickup truck into innocent pedestrians? This house may hold some of the answers. It's where the suspect lived. 38-year-old Steve Gagnon. Gaétan Tremblay is his next-door neighbor.
Complètement disconnecté.
He seemed lost, completely disconnected from reality.
C'est un gars qui faisait du camionnage.
Tremblay says Gagnon was a truck driver and recently stopped working. He turned himself into police and is facing 2 charges of dangerous driving causing death. Investigators believe the rampage was premeditated, but the victims were random.
Je l'ai vu embarquer dans son camion.
I saw him get into his truck the day of the attack, says Jean-Combe Lévesque. Now a chilling memory. Lévesque is the mayor of the town over and has known Gagnon since he was a boy.
Ça me fait une peine, comme toutes les autres.
It brings me pain, like everyone here. Lévesque also knew one of the victims, 65-year-old Gérald Charret. He was a sociable person, always out walking. He was a good man. 73-year-old Jean Lafrenière also died. And a family with young children was hit. A 1-year-old and a 3-year-old have been released from hospital, but 2 of their relatives are still being treated. The tragedy in Amqui is not the first time a vehicle has been used as a deadly weapon. Just weeks ago, a bus rammed into a daycare north of Montreal. In 2021, a pickup truck plowed into 5 members of a Muslim family in London, Ontario. While in 2018, 10 people died in the Toronto van attack.
There's no way to eliminate ramming attacks, but certainly you can diminish access to pedestrians. And so you can restrict vehicular traffic in sensitive areas.
Not far from the scene of the crime, members of the community of just 6,000 people are coming to grieve. We're here to give hope, says this priest, to show all is not lost. The Premier of Quebec is expected to arrive here tomorrow, and a mass is planned at this church on Friday to honor the 2 men who died and the many lives shattered by this attack. Donna?
All right, Touria Izri in Amqui, Quebec. Thanks. More signs of uncertainty surrounding the banking sector tonight. Markets tumbled in North America and Europe, dragged down by banking stocks and alarm about Credit Suisse, based in Switzerland. It lost 1/4 of its value, its shares sinking to an all-time low today. Investors already nervous about the collapse of 2 U.S. regional banks, now watching a Swiss bank falter. Our senior business correspondent, Anne Gaviola, is with me. Anne, what's going on here?
Investors on high alert for signs of trouble in the financial sector, Donna, and this fits the bill. The Swiss Central Bank stepped in just hours ago to offer liquidity just in case. Think of it as a financial safety net. And analysts tell me that Swiss authorities had no choice but to step up. This is Switzerland's 2nd largest lender, a bank that is too big to fail. What triggered Credit Suisse's latest troubles is the release of its annual report, which showed weakness in the bank's financial controls. Now, Credit Suisse has been plagued with problems for years. It's seen 5 successive quarters of losses, various scandals, a series of executive changes and client withdrawals. And when we talk about contagion, this may be a case of psychological, if not financial contagion.
And there's sort of contagion, not because they had any connection with Credit Suisse, but because investor sentiment changed and people were scrutinizing other banks more carefully. And Credit Suisse is seen as the weakest link.
Now, the offer of help from the Swiss Central Bank is welcome news because Credit Suisse's top shareholder, the Saudi National Bank, said it wasn't going to invest more in Credit Suisse because increasing its stake would trigger regulatory complications. Donna?
All right, and Anne, investors certainly wary. What happened to banking stocks overall today?
They took a pummeling for the most part. European markets closed sharply lower. North American stock markets, as you mentioned, were mostly in the red too, including the TSX. Investors are really nervous about this, but they're also digesting news that the American economy slowed last month. And investors are worried that this crisis isn't over, despite reassurances from government officials all around the world. We are likely to see more turmoil before this is fully behind us. But one thing to keep in mind, if some of this feels eerily reminiscent of 2007, major banks are overall on much more solid financial footing than they were back then. Donna?
All right. Anne Gaviola in Toronto, thanks. In Texas, a judge heard arguments today in a case about whether a commonly used abortion pill should be sold in the U.S. And depending on his ruling, access to the medication could be curtailed across the country. A conservative group argued the safety of the abortion pill was never properly studied, even though it's been approved for use for 20 years. Our Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Prosco is watching the case. Jackson.
Donna, this case has potentially wide-ranging implications for abortion access across the U.S., even in states where abortion is still fully legal. A conservative Christian group in Texas asked a judge to order the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to pull the abortion drug mifepristone off the market. That's significant because medical abortions using drugs, not surgery, make up about half of pregnancy terminations in the U.S. The group behind the lawsuit argued the drug should never have been approved, claiming it didn't go through proper safety evaluations, an argument the judge seemed to entertain. Mifepristone has been used with a high success rate for more than 2 decades in the U.S. and around the world. It's considered so safe it can actually be prescribed by telehealth and sent by mail in the United States. Its removal from the market would have serious impacts.
It isn't crazy to think that if you can make a case that somehow the FDA, which is one of the world's best, I think, regulatory agencies on drugs and therapeutics, that if you can make a case that they somehow were not thinking about the safety and that this was all too rushed, why not make that argument for every reproductive drug, such as birth control?
It's worth pointing out this case was specifically brought up in a jurisdiction where it would be heard by a judge who has a track record of anti-abortion statements, a practice known as judge shopping. The hearing wrapped with the judge saying a final ruling will come in the next few days. The losing side is all but certain to appeal, right up to the Supreme Court. Ever since the fall of Roe versus Wade, anti-abortion groups have been looking to chip away at the few remaining legal avenues for reproductive care using tactics exactly like this. There's real concern about the precedent this case could set in allowing a judge to interfere in regulatory decisions made by a government agency, especially when it comes to access to certain medicines. Donna?
All right, Jackson in Washington, thank you. A big development for CP Rail today. The U.S. regulator has approved its takeover of Kansas City Southern Railway. The $42 billion merger will create the first single-line rail network linking Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. The 32,000-kilometer route will stretch from Vancouver to St. John and south through the U.S. industrial heartland to ports in Mexico. The merged railway will be called Canadian Pacific Kansas City. Calgary will remain the headquarters. It will employ about 20,000 people, and the company says potentially shift up to 64,000 truckloads of goods annually off the highways. CP is expected to take control April 14th. Russia is warning the U.S. to stop what it calls hostile activity near its borders and denies its fighter jets came into contact with an unmanned American surveillance drone. The U.S. maintains a Russian fighter jet harassed and then collided with the drone, which went down in the Black Sea.
The United States will continue to fly and to operate wherever international law allows. And it is incumbent upon Russia to operate its military aircraft in a safe and professional manner.
Russia claims the drone like this one was moving deliberately towards Russian territory. It says it will attempt to retrieve the wreckage. Streamlining Canada's foreign aid. Coming up, the changes Ottawa is making and the pleas to loosen the purse strings. Last month, the federal government announced it is streamlining the way it distributes all foreign aid grants. In 2021, Canada spent $8.4 billion on overseas assistance. The bulk of that, $5 billion, was in the form of foreign aid grants. As David Aiken reports, humanitarian groups worry what streamlining that funding really means.
I'm definitely nervous to see what's going to be coming up, and so the fact that we don't know what to expect is problematic by itself.
Save the Children Canada was one of 75 aid organizations worried enough to send a joint letter to Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland looking for more aid dollars. Among other things, they argue that the world takes note that a wealthy country like Canada ranks just 13th among its peers when it comes to foreign aid spending.
It's definitely a bit of a stain in Canada's sort of global role and probably one reason why Canada was not able to secure a seat on the Security Council.
Others say it's in Canada's own interest to spend money helping others around the world.
Poverty is not good for business. We're a trading country. What we want to do is help people get out of poverty so that they can buy our stuff.
The Trudeau government has pursued what it calls a feminist foreign policy, aiming to improve gender equity and maternal and child health. As a top aide to two Liberal international development ministers, Louis Bélanger had a hand advancing those policies. Now working outside government, he too is worried there may not be enough money in this month's federal budget.
Let's do more. We have a feminist policy that is changing lives right now for millions of women and girls around the world. And now would be the worst time to cut foreign aid. Back in 1970, Canada signed on to a United Nations plan to spend 0.7% of GDP on foreign aid. 0.7%. In fact, it was a Canadian, former Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, who led the way to establish that 0.7% threshold. So where does Canada stand today? Well, we're not even spending half that amount. Just 0.32% of Canada's national income goes to help the world's poorest people. Donna?
David Aiken, thanks again. A cyclone unlike any other ahead. Why Freddy's track has been so devastating for Africa. In East Africa, a storm that's described as exceptional is not only devastating the region. Cyclone Freddy has struck twice, killing over 200 people in Malawi and Mozambique. The death toll is expected to rise in what is one of the longest and strongest tropical storms ever recorded. Mike Armstrong explains how the devastating system has stumped meteorologists.
Cyclone Freddy may have passed in some areas of Mozambique, but the scale of the devastation is only starting to be understood.
Many of the areas hit by the cyclone are very rural and remote, and I think information is now just starting to trickle in.
In neighboring Malawi, the government has an official death toll of 225, but that doesn't include dozens who are still missing. Torrential rain, followed by flooding and mudslides, have left close to 20,000 people without shelter. This woman says her home is being destroyed. She had a big family, and they are stranded. Now, the World Meteorological Organization is still studying Freddy, but says it appears to have set records. It lasted more than 5 weeks and is likely the longest tropical cyclone on record, and it may also be the strongest.
Well, it was almost essentially unbelievable. I mean, if someone had told me this could happen, I would have said, oh, I don't think so.
Now, there's another aspect of Freddy that stands out, the path it followed. This storm developed off Australia. It was named Freddy officially way back on February 6th. It then crossed the Indian Ocean, gaining strength over the water as it went. Cyclone Freddy made landfall over Madagascar February 21st and hit the continent on the 24th. Now, a normal storm would stay over land and dissipate, but this one turned back. It headed east over the water again, gained strength again, and then turned back west. This past weekend, Freddy hit the continent a second time. It was that 1-2 punch that compounded things.
The fact that there is, let's say, no dryness of the soils means that it can't absorb the water, so you get more flooding effects.
Now, just as relief efforts in Malawi have been hampered by the rain and mud, it's done the same to funerals. This was a service Wednesday. The country's president attended and called on the international community for help. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
McMaster mission next. The university celebrates a space launch and what they hope it leads to.
This is a great example of what innovation can do.
This is the latest fashion in spacesuits. NASA unveiled a new spacesuit astronauts will wear on the Artemis 3 mission to the moon, scheduled for 2025. The new suits have greater mobility. The boots are thermally insulated for treks to the moon's south pole. This is also the first spacesuit that has been designed specifically to fit women. A SpaceX rocket lifted off last night from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and it was closely watched by a team of students from McMaster University. They spent 8 years working on a special payload carried by the rocket, a satellite. as Mike Drolet reports, as part of a push to get young Canadians interested in space exploration.
And liftoff of CRS-27. Go Falcon, go Dragon.
It never gets old watching a Dragon roar into space, even if it's just hauling 2,800 kilos of supplies and experiments to the International Space Station. But tucked away within all that payload sits the hard work of a whole bunch of Canadian students obsessed with the aerospace industry.
Before setting foot on campus ever here at McMaster, as a high school graduate, I made it a goal to join this team and launch a satellite they're building to space.
Jay Patel was part of a large team at McMaster University that built this high-tech radiation detector. It's not the spaceship that will eventually fly to Mars or the habitats that will form the first colony on the moon, but it will help keep the astronauts on those missions safe.
The data we collect is going to be useful in terms of studying how that radiation can affect astronauts in elongated space missions.
The CubeSat program was developed by the Canadian Space Agency to not only teach students how to build stuff for space, but to actually do it. 4 of the 15 cross-Canada projects greenlit in 2018, including McMaster's, were part of the launch. The Fort McMurray wildfires inspired one that has infrared cameras to study and hopefully prevent another disaster.
Seeing that something you've worked on has gone to space, it completely changes it for you.
Joanne Kai was part of the team at the University of Alberta that built it. As a third-year mechanical engineering student, she didn't think she'd get this type of opportunity until after she graduated, much less watch the launch from a VIP-only rooftop.
After the launch, I was just closing my eyes and thinking of every single part of the satellite that I worked on. And I was like, that's in space now. That's in space now. This board that I worked on is in space. This little part that I made is in space. This little thing that I helped test is in space.
And bigger things, no doubt, are on the horizon. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Tyee Lake near Quesnel, British Columbia. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.